You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
So whether the market is doing gangbusters or looking more like a dumpster fire, a good, well-rounded stock portfolio is necessary for any investor. Robinhood is a platform that aims to democratize finance for everybody. Robinhood believes everyone should have access to financial markets, so what they did was they built their system from the ground up to make investing friendly, approachable, and understandable for newcomers and experts alike. What I love about Robinhood is that you don't need an account minimum to start. There are zero fees for trading, and you can even purchase cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin and Ethereum. Join today by tapping the link in the show notes to get a free stock just like that. I mean, it's just free, just for signing up. And this free stock can be anything from SiriusXM to Apple or any of the other thousands of other publicly traded companies just like that. You've got everything to gain and nothing to lose. So go get your free stock today by checking out that Robinhood link in the show notes today. Whether you're looking for a comedic retelling of the history of the modern libertarian movement or a dark comedy about the seedy world of American politics, my books, Stay Away from the Libertarians, as well as How to Succeed in Politics and Other Forms of Devil Worship, have been entertaining thousands of readers throughout the world since 2018. Whether you're looking for the next great book on your reading list or considering a funny and captivating book for the Politico or history nut in your life, you can grab a copy of either Stay Away from the Libertarians or How to Succeed in Politics and Other Forms of Devil Worship today on either Amazon or Barnes & Noble online. Amazon links for the print and ebook editions of both books are available in the show notes.
Prepare yourself. You're on the run with Remso W. Martinez.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. It's been a interesting year, to say the least. Remember a few months ago when we had to worry about toilet paper shortages, and then it was the meat shortages, and then it was the murder hornets, and then people said that having sex could spread more corona, so then couples were staying away from each other, and then Joe Exotic hit Netflix, and now, cities are burning down. It's been interesting. It's like the narration of the story of 2020 has been voiced by the dude who played the parrot from Aladdin, and the whole thing is directed by Michael Bay. It's the whole planes, trains, and automobiles type of Avengers Endgame crossover for me to go ahead and throw in all the pop culture references to say that things are weird. Things are strange. And if we're doing one thing now that we may not have traditionally done, it's, as my good friend Chris Spangle has coined it, this is the end of the age of comfort. And we're having to talk about a lot of different things. Recently, I was on a few programs discussing my experience as a multiracial American. For those of you that don't know, it's not often you have someone with the middle name William sandwiched in between Remso and Martinez. And it's been quite odd. My entire life has been, really the story of multiple cultures, multiple ethnicities coming together to go ahead and create my family. And watching what is going on in America now, it's quite strange because now you're seeing people who wouldn't typically want to talk about this changing their tune. You're seeing people actually begin to really discuss what is it like to live in another person's shoes. It often seems that while a lot of people may still get stuck in a lot of the political ruts they do when it comes to their dialogue and conversations, now people, even more so than when the Black Lives Matter movement started 4 years ago, out of the flames of the Ferguson riots and the death of multiple black men at the hands of police, now it seems that people really want to understand what's going on. So hopefully create a better future for ourselves and our I can't even talk today. Our posterity. One of those crazy ACT, SAT words that I should probably learn to have pronounced by now. But where do you go for good information about this topic, and where can we actually start the conversations? Well, if you're like me, you like to actually, put an objective foot forward. And experiment with certain things, try and really understand from an objective lens how we really view each other. Recently, good friend of the show, Jen Sidorova, one of my favorite Young Voices contributors and the host of Think Tankers on YouTube, did a video talking about 3 very important experiments in terms of how we view race in America on her channel. I'm going to go ahead and link to that video in the show notes, but you've heard enough of me talking. I want to talk to her about this. Jen, welcome to the program. It's great to have you on.
Thank you, and good to be here.
So I've got to ask, when people are talking about, everything that has to do with racial confusion and racial inequality in America, I've never heard anyone bring up the 3 experiments you mentioned in your episode. And as I watched it, it was just fascinating to see how people of all races, predominantly white individuals and African-American individuals, it was just so interesting to see them partake in these 3 different experiments. I never learned about them in school. I took enough psychology classes. None of them were ever brought up. What made you jump into this, and what did you discover as you were learning about these 3 different experiments to see how we view each other in terms of race in the United States?
So my training and my work as a young professional, kind of early in my career, I went to Stony Brook. I did a master's in economics there, but then I did a master's in political science, and that program is known for its political psychology, for its political psychology field. And I was exposed to a lot of research that has to deal with race and prejudice as part of their political psychology course. So what made me talk about these 3 particular experiments was that it was just instinctively almost that when I saw what's going on in the country, I thought, how can I as a social scientist contribute? And I thought, well, I know about these findings that we've had in political psychology and just in political science for so long that nobody talked about. And most of the rhetoric that I see in the media is pretty basic. It mostly just talks about conservatives as people who don't like welfare. And since the majority of welfare recipients are Black in this country, it's been almost like an equality sign has been drawn between conservatives and prejudice and racial prejudice. And when it comes to liberals, it's on the other side. Again, when it comes to the conversations in the media, they're mostly liberals are mostly associated with being accepting of welfare programs, and as a result, they're seen as people who are less prejudiced. But what these experiments and in other research that I know in political psychology tells us is that it doesn't really matter. Although different kind of parts of the brain are activated when we're exposed to the stimuli, to the racial stimuli, it doesn't matter whether we are conservative or liberal. Pretty much everyone is prejudiced in their own way. It just depends on the circumstances that the person is at the moment.
Yeah, and I don't see, prejudice is a word that I think everyone kind of understands, but we don't seem to really look into it. I mean, individuals are prejudiced against other people beyond just race. If we're looking at people that are applying for a job, we're going to be prejudicial based off their appearance. Are we going to want to talk to the person that showed up with their, pants below their waist and they haven't gotten a haircut and they smell like cigarette smoke? Or are we going to go for the person who's wearing a suit and a tie and looks prepared for the job? We're making instinctive judgments based off the outward appearance of people. If we're on the street and we're going to ask somebody for directions somewhere, are we going to talk to the shirtless person, sitting down on the sidewalk with a ton of tattoos? Or are we going to go talk to the police officer? Most people are going to go ask the cop. So we make these judgments. And when I try and tell this to some of my friends who get a little bit more heated on this issue, I try and break it down to the point where, listen, we all have our own inherent prejudices. Just because of that does not make you a terrible person. But it's something that's kind of just grounded in how you react towards things in the world. Some people take it beyond that, and then they become, openly hateful or openly racist or, incredibly unbendingly prejudiced. But overall, there are things that we can learn about ourselves to see how we interact with those around us. Would you say that's kind of accurate?
So there's definitely two different things. It's open prejudice and what we call in political science is old-fashioned racism. And then what is another thing is an implicit bias. And open prejudice, open or old-fashioned racism, it would be something that you kind of talked about. If we see two people walking in the street, we would automatically, we would just not come to the black person. If we see a black and a white person, we would go to the white person because we would think they're less. They would not show any aggression towards us. We just think they're more safe. And then implicit prejudice is something that we exhibit while we have no control over. For instance, if we have two candidates for work and they have absolutely the same skills and we just see their pictures in their resume and we just take the white and we go to the white person, that would be something like that, because then there's literally nothing that changes the circumstances. It's just the color of the skin. And when it comes to implicit prejudice, and that's something that if old-fashioned racism we would see, and we as people we would try to do actions that are against it. There's literally nothing we can do against implicit prejudice. Because it's hidden. And so I'm talking in my video, I'm talking about on one of those experiments, the implicit association test, that kind of tells you, and then everyone can go onto the website and take the test, and it tells you how biased you actually are. And when it comes to implicit prejudice, there's one other experiment that I don't talk about in the video, but I recently came across that. And in that experiment, black and white respondents, non-conservative whites mostly, were presented with political speeches of two candidates. And there was a black and a white politician. And then after that stimuli, the respondents were asked to evaluate the candidates on a couple of parameters. And so, whereas when they evaluated those two people on their competence, on their kind of favorability, all people were more favorable towards the black person. And then when they then were asked, how do you evaluate that person based on intelligence? They were more preferable towards the white person. So what that means is that although non-conservative whites could be prejudiced towards blacks, they will not openly reveal it on something like qualifications. And so they might show political support for a candidate of color or a black candidate, but inherently they don't actually support it. It's just almost like overcompensation. And what it leads to is that although in the moment they might reveal support for the candidate, they don't actually support them honestly. And if they go into the voting booth, we don't know what's going to happen there. They might reveal their true preferences that we're not going to control for. And when it comes to experiments in political science and in psychology, a lot of it has to deal with revealed preferences. And although all the respondents know that they're not, that their responses are anonymous, they never truly believe that. So they end up kind of biasing their response because they think, oh, what if somebody knows that I'm responding and they know that I'm prejudiced against black people? I don't know. I don't want that. So that's another kind of caveat that we have to deal with in social sciences.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned how people are willing to overcompensate on something in order to make it seem like they're not for something else. It's a catch-22, and I saw this with the 2016 election, I was running phone banks for a Republican candidate, and we would have to include questions about Donald Trump as well. And what we saw was a massive difference between the registered voters, we would call, in terms of how they would respond to us versus how they actually voted. If I could predict the outcome of our district and where our state would go based off the survey results, I would have thought that the Democrats would have not only won our congressional district, but a majority of people were voting for Hillary Clinton in 2016. But then when we look at what the actual results were, not only did the Republican win, but he won with a large majority. And Hillary Clinton, though she won the state of Virginia, she did not win by the overwhelming margin that we thought. And when we were talking to people afterwards, we saw that a large majority of individuals that we surveyed were worried that their data or their information would show how they actually thought about something. Like they would be publicly shamed for who they voted for, who they didn't vote for. And it's always interesting to see that, because it's almost like people are willing to almost die on the sword of what they think is the correct stance to take publicly versus what they actually want to do, which is why we see this disparity that you mentioned. They might say one thing in public, but then when they go behind the curtain to go cast their vote, it's something completely different. I want to go ahead and run through the 3 experiments that you mentioned in your video. They're incredibly fascinating. And folks, I'm going to go ahead and link to the video and everything else that Jen and I discuss in the show notes. So go ahead and check those out after this episode if you want to see the full video yourself and maybe take some of the tests and surveys that we mentioned. The first experiment you mentioned, this is the one that I had to go back and watch several times, because this actually hit me somewhat personally, and this is the doll experiment. Can you explain that?
Sure, that's a pretty simple experiment, but very, very fascinating for the time. It took place in the 40s and the 50s when 2 Black researchers were trying to contribute to ending the segregation. And one of the points that they were trying to make is that the self-esteem of Black kids is suffering because of segregation. And I guess that's what motivated them. And what they did was they went to kindergarten and they showed little Black kids, they basically gave them a choice between 2 dolls. And one of them was a Black doll and another one was a white doll. And they asked them to pick a doll that they liked. And then there were a bunch of other questions like, which doll do you think is the nice doll? Which doll do you think is the evil doll? And they found out that most Black kids were choosing the white doll. They thought the white doll was the pretty one, the nice one, and the Black doll was the evil one. And so they concluded that that must be proof that Black kids do indeed suffer some sort of self-hatred and self-esteem issues. And that experiment, there were replications of that experiment, pretty much led to similar or same conclusions. The only problem with the original experiment was that they didn't control for socioeconomic variables like the age of the kids or their economic status. But overall, from the standpoint of science, social science is a very, very innovative experience, because you don't ask the person how do they feel about themselves or anything, because the person might try to hide and kids are too young for that. Mm-hmm. And you just give them this sort of stimuli that indirect way of controlling for how do they feel about themselves.
And I mean, it was, there's something heartbreaking when people watch this video, because you're seeing them ask questions like, which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the pretty doll? And you always see these young Black kids, they're constantly pointing to the white doll. This, and I mean, you mentioned, Hollywood and the media in the other experiments, but I mean, this is one that I have seen from children. And I even remember seeing this when I was a child. It was, often I get criticized by conservatives for this. I consider myself a very conservative individual, but this is one criticism I get. When they change the race of characters in movies, or they make a Black character or a character of different gender, it often doesn't bother me, because I understand the need to see yourself represented in the media or in the different, public outlets that you would expect anyone to want to be seen in. And it always bothered me, coming from a Latino background. You never see Latinos predominantly in a positive light on either the media or coming from popular culture, movies, and TV. One of my favorite actors right now is Oscar Isaacson, who played Poe Dameron in the recent Star Wars films. And it's because he's one of the first Latino actors. He's from Guatemala originally, who he didn't have to play a gangbanger or an immigrant in order to build up his film reputation before he could finally be the hero in a film. There have been many black actors, such as Jamie Foxx, who said, if you want to be in a good movie as a black actor, you can go ahead and be the main character in that. But if you want to win an Oscar, you have to be a black actor who plays a slave. And when I heard that, it really did kind of touch me in a way, because it's like, this is how we see ourselves. And when you're so constantly inundated with this type of propaganda in a way, whether it's implicit or it's done unintentionally, we see ourselves based off how others are viewing us in these grand forms. And to see children in this somewhat self-hating way, it bothered me in a way I didn't see it coming. What was your initial reaction when you saw this?
Well, I think it was similar to yours. It made me think about other things, like, what about my own nationality? I'm obviously Russian, and I do see a lot of negative portrayal of Russians in the media. Now, I don't necessarily encounter racial prejudice, because you can see from me that I'm Russian, right? You don't make this automatic judgment that's being made on people of color, obviously. But again, it kind of speaks to the overall point that what is the way that the media, that maybe you and me or Hollywood or any one of us in the media, how can we contribute to this change that people, not see role models like they are, and at the same time, so they don't develop this self-hatred feeling. And at the same time, when it comes to Hollywood, and as someone who is part of the industry, I could speak to that too. It sometimes could be hard for a movie producer or a director to kind of put these two notions, the race or gender, and then the message that the character is bringing, because it kind of adds another layer of complexity. And for a viewer, it could be cognitively more complex to perceive these two layers, just because historically we've been so primed to everything is white, right? All the Disney characters are white. All the commercials we grew up are white. So, but I do believe that adding diversity gradually could lead to that, and we do have actually such results in social science and in political science, that once more diversity is introduced into the environment of a person, they do perceive the world as multidimensional, and they do perceive diversity of skin as something of a norm. And we also, when it comes to experiments and other findings in political science, the more multiracial, the more diverse the environment of the person is, we do see that correlation with overall openness to experience, openness to communicate with other races, and having friends among people of different color. So we do have hope, and we do have a lot of experiments that support that.
Definitely. The second experiment is something we touched on a little bit earlier, but we didn't go into depth with. This is correct me if I'm wrong, this is the implicit bias experiment.
The welfare queen experiment.
Yes. Can you explain that?
Sure. So the welfare queen is kind of a composite image, a composite character that was used to characterize a person who's taking advantage of the welfare system. So they might be able to work, but they're just collecting welfare practically. And so the way that the researchers kind of introduced race into that experiment was that they had two stories about welfare recipients, and they manipulated the race. In one case, it was a woman who was white. In another case, it was a woman who was black. And as the main character of the story, or a story in welfare. And in the third kind of group, the respondents saw just the welfare story without any person showing up in a picture. And in the fourth group, it was just a random story. It had nothing to do with welfare. So there were 4 groups of people. In each group had a different prime. And then after that, they were all asked the same questions. And they do find that people who did see, who did watch the welfare story with a black woman were overall more negative towards welfare. And on the other kind of, and that's kind of something that we kind of would expect just based on the other findings in political and social science. As social scientists, we would expect that finding. I think what was interesting to me is that those respondents who do have the most liberal views, but watched the white woman story. So the welfare recipient was portrayed as a white woman in their story. At the end of the day, when they were asked questions after the experiment, they were even more negative towards blacks, and they were
that did not surprise me as much as I thought it was going to be, because one of the biggest changes in my life was when I moved from Virginia down deep south into the black belts of Alabama, right outside of Selma. And one of the things that I kind of grew up not really, I don't know if this was a stereotype or a prejudice, but it often seems like, and journalists such as Charlie LaDuff from Fox News and previously New York Times, he discussed this in both of his books, Detroit and Us Guys. But I mean, the idea of white poverty in America. And this is one reason why Andrew Yang was often criticized, because he had a large number of single white men who live below the poverty line supporting his campaign as he talked about automation and labor laws and things like that. It's because, often when we think of white people who are poor, and I hear this primarily from my white friends, it's because they did something wrong, or they chose not to be productive, or they had a criminal past or something. It almost seems like if you're white and you're poor, it's always your fault. And then when I discuss this really kind of the same topic with people, and I bring up, the fact that you have a large number, an unhealthy number of African Americans who are on the same welfare programs as these poor white people are, they're disadvantaged. It's because they're victims of circumstance. It seems like there's almost no reason other than it's completely your fault if you're white and you're poor, and it's not your fault if you're black and you're poor and you're on welfare. And I think both of those are very unhealthy assumptions for both of it. I've seen this growing up, with a Latino name. My mom's family is Korean. My dad's family is Puerto Rican. When I lived in Texas and I went to school, it often shocked the teachers, the white teachers, that I was A, not living in a trailer park. 2, I was an American citizen. 3, I spoke English. And 4, both my parents were still together. It often seems like we're quick to apply blame to one group of people blanketly, and then we're going to go ahead and provide the same yet different blanket presuppositions about another group of people. It's always fascinated me how that works.
And that kind of reminds me of another experiment and another study that's one of the seminal studies in political psychology, is that when they looked at kind of attitudes towards welfare in Europe and in the United States and the causes for such attitudes, they found, and the reason for them doing that, their motivation was to find out why do we in the United States do not have the same welfare system as in Europe. And so when they looked at what Europeans versus Americans think of poor people, they found that Europeans mostly think that poor people are unfortunate and disadvantaged. It's just bad luck. whereas Americans perceive poor people as lazy. They think they're just not working hard enough. And
I mean, that seems like that's a very American thing. We're a culture of, at the end of the day, I think we'll always be a right of center culture where we're rugged individualists. We believe that in this land of opportunity, if you're not doing well, it's your fault. And that's something I haven't seen when I've been to other countries. I lived in Australia for a few years and I've been to Canada. And it's interesting that that's not the same thing. I think it's a uniquely American mindset.
Right. It has to do with Protestant culture that was brought back in when the country was formed. And we still hold on to that. And it's a good thing for some things. But when it comes to attitudes towards poor and poor being disproportionately Black in this country, it complicates in-group, out-group relations and racial prejudice, and this whole conversation on whether there should be support for certain groups of people or not, where should there be support based on the skin color or not, and attitudes towards affirmative action. All of those things get wrapped up in those very, very basic values that we hold as Americans, and the need and the appreciation of hard work being one of the primary ones.
Do you think there's ever a way to divorce the actual argument for either reforming welfare or reforming affirmative action without it getting into the racial side of things? Or do you think that's what some politicians want? They don't want to have these discussions, therefore they always jump to it becoming a racial argument.
So one thing that I think would be fair to bring up here is that our rhetoric, our framing and priming, so basically the way we discuss policies and a very specific words that we use when discuss policies do affect outcomes. For instance, when you talk about welfare in terms of government programs that assist poor, and you never actually mention the world welfare programs, you get completely different outcomes and completely different reactions from people from when you frame it in terms of welfare programs. Because welfare programs are stereotyped, and it all just biases people right away. So I think one of the ways to carry on the conversation in policy in this country would be to sort of devoid it of partisan framing, partisan priming, and sort of feelings, and focus on the numbers. For something like this that's heavily emotional, I think the more prudent way would be just to become rational, the homos economicus, the rational consumers, and talk about what would be the effects of certain programs, and not frame them in terms of, liberal versus conservatives, or any sort of frames that are used in that discussion. I think another actually field like that is immigration, where framing, priming, and use of euphemisms is used quite a bit. And I will probably be talking about that in one of my videos in the future. But that field was basically consumed with all sorts of euphemisms, like using a term anchor baby versus birthright citizenship, and illegal alien versus undocumented immigrant, which practically kind of mean the same thing, but are used differently and develop completely different attitudes from the public. And that's not what should be the core of our policy solutions. The core of the policy solutions should be whether it's beneficial for the people in the country economically, first and foremost. That's what I think.
I completely agree with you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you do that video. I mean, to kind of touch on this topic, it's one of those things that, as you mentioned, why do we use certain terms? Why do we say certain things in order to elicit certain emotional reactions? It always reminded me of E-Verify, the system that employers, where we basically turned employers into police officers, basically saying you have to go ahead and verify their citizenship and their legal status and everything else before you do that. And if they're applying for this job and you find out that they're not able to work, you have to go ahead and report them. That always, that always bothered me on the property rights issue, because if you want to hire somebody who's willing to work the requirements and you agree upon a pay, you should have the right to hire whoever the heck you want. I never saw that as an immigration thing, and I'm usually pretty more conservative on the immigration issue, but I've never liked the idea of E-Verify. But then, look at who this was being really targeted at. E-Verify started primarily in border states. It started really in my home state of Arizona. And it was because in the mid-2000s, you had a lot of, strong, pro immigration restrictionist conservatives, and you had a lot of pro-labor union Democrats who were really kind of shouting the same thing. We don't want cheap Mexican labor here because Mexicans are taking our jobs. E-Verify was really only something that existed in border states. It spread throughout the rest of the country, but it was really a border state thing to stop Mexicans from taking jobs that were meant for Americans, predominantly white Americans for that degree. That's what both Republicans and Democrats, at the end of the day, while they were speaking across each other, that's what it was coming towards. And I'll never forget, there was a story by Dr. Tom Palmer from the Cato Institute. He was having lunch with a friend of his from the UK who had been living in Scottsdale, Arizona for over a decade. And this is around the time of when cops were basically pulling people over to check their IDs if they thought these people were potentially illegal immigrants. And this British gentleman, when he was asked about how he felt about cops going around and checking people for their paperwork, he looked at him and he said, "Tom, they're not looking for me." And in a way, he's certainly true, because what were they doing? Why were they doing it? They were primarily targeting the Hispanic and Latin community. They weren't looking for illegal Canadians. They weren't looking for illegal French or Brits. They were looking for Mexicans. And while we could definitely have a conversation about, immigration reform and how to protect the civil rights of American citizens, while at the same time being fair towards people who come into this country, even illegally, it always came down to who were they looking for. They weren't looking for the British guy. But yeah, and that's just my tangent on that. What was the third experiment, the last one mentioned?
Sure. So the last experiment again had to deal with kids, and they got a bunch of multiracial kids and adults, and they asked them what are their expectations of friendships of those multiracial kids, and the bigger finding was that adults predicted that multiracial kids would mostly have Black friends, whereas multiracial kids themselves predicted they will mostly have white friends. So that tells you something about how multiracial people see themselves, especially when they're children, versus how adults see them, and pretty much what expectation is society putting on them. Adults being a representative of kind of the society, what expectations the society puts on them. Yeah. Why
do you think there was such a disparity between who the kids opted to be friends with versus who the adults thought they would be friends with?
Well, they didn't go into whys, and we kind of until you actually get the proof, we don't really speculate on the whys in political science, especially in this kind of realm of the experimentation. Mm-hmm. But I believe that as kids, those kids are probably seeing themselves as a part of a society, and it depends on whether they grow up with. If they grow up in a predominantly white neighborhood, they see themselves as white, having white. They probably see themselves as for what they are, but they do assume that they could have white friends, and the culture that we live in is mostly white culture. So as being part of the society, they do assume, I guess most people are white. I'm going to mostly have white friends. Whereas adults probably see society in terms of groups and in terms of interest groups, in-group, out-group dynamic. And they would think that multiracial kids will mostly have Black friends because they will be marginalized and they will be put in a group that's marginalized.
So
that's my speculation on the issue. Again, the researchers don't go into that.
Got it. It almost seems like more of like a nurture versus nature situation in that case.
Yes, and I think that makes sense. I think I am providing you with a plausible hypothesis on the matter because for kids it's a lot more basic. They just report what they see around themselves, whereas adults are able to compile more complicated notions, and that's what they do. I guess that's a plausible again. It's plausible that they would assume that because people of color are marginalized, they would be friends with others who are marginalized, and they do know objectively that there is prejudice against Black people and people of color in this country, so they put them in the same group.
I could see that. It almost reminds me of it was a study done by some journalist. I saw it on Oprah like years ago. They were discussing how when you look at foster families or families who are most likely to adopt children in the United States, it's predominantly white couples who are willing to adopt children. And when you look at the number of children who are adopted by white families in the United States, usually if it's, let's say, an orphaned Black child or an orphaned Asian child, as they grow up, they tend to adopt the racial identity of their adopted parents in a way. So, and I had a problem with it because it almost felt too opinionated, less like an objective study. But she basically tried saying that this isn't good because you're eliminating the child's racial and cultural identity and you're replacing it with a white one. I saw that and I thought that was kind of stupid to a large degree because the child doesn't care. The child doesn't know. The child just wants to grow up being loved in a good family and live their life the way they want to. I never saw it as parents kind of pushing it on them, but they're only raising them the only way they know how. So I could definitely see how, and this is all just a guess as we've discussed, folks. It's more of a where am I, how have I lived, who am I living with situation, and everything else is kind of taught afterwards the older you get, which is why the adults in the situation, just my guess, have such a different opinion than the children growing up without understanding all these other factors.
There's another seminal experiment with college kids in Ivy League, in a famous Ivy League school, and I think they are intentionally disguising the name of the school they're doing the experiment in, but it's known. It's an Ivy League school, and it's college kids. So those were college kids of color, and they found that when placed in an Ivy League school and going, those kids, when they became part of a sorority that was based on their skin color, they became more aware of racial prejudice and stereotypes when they were before. This is because those kids mostly grew up in either diverse or white neighborhood, and that happens a lot with college kids freshman kids of color in an Ivy League school. A lot of them would be from those more affluent school districts, and they would be mostly multiracial or white. So those, until they go to college, they're not even aware. I guess they're aware because they learn history, but they're not as aware of prejudice and stereotypes against people of their skin color before they become immersed into an environment where they pretty much are forced to segregate or just hang out with somebody who looks like that.
That's one reason why I've always felt like with a lot of our racial conversations, we're ignoring a lot of the real issues. And this is just my opinion. People from both the left and the right have taken criticism to it, and I understand. But I've always felt like a lot of our racial issues aren't even really racial issues, but it's almost a classist issue. To use that term vaguely, it's usually less about black and white, and it's more about poor and not poor. Because I always felt like if you wanted to really fix a lot of the racial inequality, you had to address why is there such an income or job inequality within certain communities. And I think in that experiment, when you look at just college campuses as an example, people I think are more likely to divert where they're going to spend more of their time or associate with more of who they want to based off people that are in the same socioeconomic class versus just who they identify with on a racial level. What do you think about that?
This is true. And in the case with Ivy League schools, at that point, kids are pretty much the same demographic. So they're the same age, they're the same socioeconomic status, more or less. So then there's more kind of filtering. There's more ways of separating themselves or getting into a group, and that's when race becomes a significant variable. And this is very true that you're saying that this is a poor versus rich issue more so than black versus white. The issue, however, the deeper issue here is that blacks are disproportionately poor. And that's why it gets complicated. That's why it becomes a racial issue. Just for that reason alone, that blacks are unfortunately disproportionately poor. And that's why this rich versus poor issue becomes black versus white issue, because whites are, most of the rich people, I'm pretty sure are Caucasian, and then most poor people are black. Well, not most here, but a good majority. Yeah, the good majority, I guess, if you divide people into rich or white. So it kind of by proxy, it becomes a white versus black issue, although in the roots of it is the economic inequality.
Very true. Well, Jen, we've covered a lot today, and I highly recommend that everyone listening should go ahead and check out the video and everything else that I'm going to include in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed this conversation. I know my listeners definitely did too. If people want to follow your work on YouTube and everything else you're doing online, how could they do so?
Sure. Check out my YouTube channel, Think Tanker with Jen Sidorova, and my Twitter at Jen_Sidorova, and my Instagram. Instagram is the best, so we could be friends in the real life. It was great talking to you. It was great. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. Well, folks, go ahead and follow her everywhere. You know how the internet works. As always, go ahead and check me out on Parler. I'm just at Remso, REMSO. If you see at Remso2 pop up, message that person, call him a loser, and subscribe to the show. Share this episode because, the age of comfort, whether we want to admit it or not, comfort has to end so progress can be made. And if we're talking to each other, we're not screaming at each other. And I hope we can go ahead and discuss this more often. As always, I'm Remso W. Martinez. You're listening to On the Run. I'll talk to you later. Good night.
Check out our other shows and more from the We Are Libertarians Network at wearelibertarians.com.